The night I collapsed on the Alpha King's chest, he had already destroyed 3 women that year. I didn't know that yet. I didn't know his name, his scars, or the way his heartbeat sounded in the dark. Deep and territorial, like a war drum that had forgotten there was supposed to be a war. All I knew was exhaustion. 22 hours on my feet, scrubbing stone floors until my fingers stopped feeling like mine. And when I stumbled through the wrong door in the north tower of Stonecrest Keep and dropped onto what I thought was an empty bed of furs, I pressed my cheek against warm skin and fell into the first real sleep I'd had since they took everything from me. I woke up to 30 wolves crowded in the outer doorway, and the Alpha King's arm locked around my waist. His body curved around mine. His breathing steady for what Elder Fen would later call the first time in 13 months. But that comes later. Let me start at the beginning. The day I stopped having a name. My name is Vickie Bales, and I was not sold. Selling implies a transaction. Implies someone on my side of the table. What happened to me was simpler and crueler than that. My village lost a war on a Thursday, and by Friday morning I was property. Not dramatically. Not with chains or ceremony or the theater of an auction block. The Iron Blood Pack's territorial expansion reached Ashfin Settlement on a gray autumn morning, and their catalogers arrived 2 hours behind the warriors. They counted the surviving structures, counted the livestock, counted the people. Then they counted me. Female, the cataloger said to no one in particular, the way you'd note a measurement rather than acknowledge a person. Age? 23, I said. I'm standing right here. He didn't look up. He wrote something in his ledger, a number probably, or a notation that converted my entire existence into a unit of labor value, and told the overseer behind him that I was fit for keep service. My neighbor Era grabbed my arm as they moved me toward the cart. I told her it was fine. I didn't know yet whether that was true. Stonecrest Keep rose out of the northern highlands like something the land itself had tried to swallow and failed. Black granite, ancient, massive, built not for beauty but for permanence. Every wall a statement that the Iron Blood Pack had been here before you arrived and intended to remain after you were gone. I came in a cart with 9 other assigned workers, all of us from settlements absorbed in the expansion, all of us quiet in the particular way of people still calculating what they have left. We were processed in the lower yard by a woman named Marta, the keep's head overseer, who had the posture of someone who had never in her life doubted a decision she'd made, and the voice to match. Names are a courtesy, she told us. You'll answer to your assignment. Floor detail, kitchen rotation, or yard work. 6 days on, 1 rest. You'll eat what's provided. You'll sleep in the east dormitories. And you will not, under any circumstance, for any reason, enter the north tower. The woman beside me, older, practical-looking, raised her hand. What's in the north tower? Marta looked at her the way you look at someone who has just asked to touch a live flame to check if it's hot. The Alpha King's private quarters, she said. The last 3 women who entered without authorization are in the keep's medical ward. She paused. 2 of them. The 3rd is buried in the eastern grounds. She let that sit exactly long enough to become permanent. They don't speak anymore. Either of them. She let that settle into the stone of the yard. Then she assigned me to floor detail. I became invisible. In a keep this large, invisibility is the only currency a slave can earn, and I intended to spend every piece of it on survival. Keep my head down. Do the work. Outlast the term. Go home to whatever Ashfin had left to go home to. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It accounted for everything except the door that was already open, and the war drum heartbeat of the man behind it, counting down to something neither of us could yet name. They gave me a number before they gave me an assignment. 14. Scratched onto a wooden disc on a leather cord and dropped around my neck by a cataloger who didn't look at my face while he did it. I stood in the lower yard of Stonecrest Keep with the disc resting against my collarbone and thought, this is what it feels like to be subtracted from yourself. The cart ride had taken 2 days. 10 of us from 3 different settlements, none of us speaking much past the first hour. There is a particular silence that falls over people who are still deciding whether what has happened to them is real. We sat in it together, strangers held in common by the specific gravity of having lost everything on the same Thursday. Marta was waiting when we arrived. She was a broad woman, not tall, built like something structural, the kind of person who looks like she was designed to hold weight without bending. Her hair was iron gray, pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped making decorative decisions about herself years ago. She stood at the center of the lower yard with a ledger tucked under one arm and looked at the 10 of us the way a carpenter looks at lumber. Assessing grain. Checking for warping. Names are a courtesy, she said, without introduction, without preamble. You'll answer to your assignment number while you're here. Floor detail, kitchen rotation, yard work. 6 days on, 1 rest. You eat what's provided. You sleep in the east dormitories, second corridor, assigned bunk only. She turned a page in the ledger without looking down at it. You do not wander. You do not enter guest quarters uninvited. You do not go above the 3rd floor of the main keep without a senior staff escort. She paused then, and the pause had weight. And you do not enter the North Tower. Not for any reason. Not if you hear something. Not if someone tells you to. Not if the door is standing open and the corridor looks empty. You see that tower, you turn around, you walk away, and you thank whatever you pray to that you had the sense to do it. The woman beside me, Sarah, I'd learned her name on the cart, former miller's assistant from a settlement called Duskford, raised her hand. She had the look of someone who needed information the way other people needed water, and couldn't stop herself from seeking it even when seeking it was unwise. What's in the North Tower? Marta looked at her. Not unkindly. The way you look at someone standing too close to an edge, who doesn't yet know the edge is there. The Alpha King's private quarters, she said. The last 3 women who entered without authorization are accounted for in the keep's medical ward. Another pause, precisely calibrated. 2 of them. The 3rd is buried in the eastern grounds. The 2 in the ward are alive, technically. They don't speak. They don't eat without assistance. Their wolves broke under the dominance pressure and their minds followed. She closed the ledger. The one in the ground submitted so completely her heart forgot to keep beating. She was 24. She had volunteered. Nobody raised their hand after that. I was assigned to floor detail. The Great Hall, the Eastern Corridor, the receiving rooms on the 2nd floor. Stone on my knees 6 days out of 7. A scrub brush in hands that were already calloused and got more so. The work was hard and mindless, and I was grateful for both. Hard and mindless left no room for grief, and grief was the one thing I could not afford if I intended to survive this. I learned to keep the way you learn any new terrain, carefully, incrementally, with attention to what was safe and what wasn't. I learned which corridors had cross drafts and which were warm. I learned that the kitchen staff ate better than the floor detail, and that Marta noticed everything but only acted on what she deemed operationally relevant. I learned that the other assigned workers were, almost without exception, people like me. Not broken, not compliant, just quietly recalculating what survival required of them now. I learned to be invisible. Number 14, moving through the corridors of Stonecrest Keep with a scrub brush and lowered eyes. Present enough to do the work and absent enough not to attract attention. I was good at it. I had been good at it for 11 days when I made my first mistake. I looked up. Petra found me on my 4th day, which she later told me was 2 days later than she usually made contact with new floor assignments. She'd been watching me first, she said, to determine whether I was worth the risk of being known by. I asked her what had decided it. She said I mopped in straight lines, which apparently indicated psychological stability, and that I hadn't cried once in 4 days, which indicated either resilience or dangerous emotional suppression, and either one was more useful than average. She was 27, small, dark-haired, with sharp eyes that moved constantly and a mouth that stayed still unless she had decided what it was safe to say. She had been at Stonecrest for 4 years, longer than any other assigned worker currently in the East dormitories, and she wore that tenure the way some people wear seniority. Not with pride exactly, but with the particular authority of someone who has outlasted every prediction made about them. She sat beside me at the far end of the meal table that evening, set her bowl down without asking, and said quietly and without looking at me, "You need to know things, and I need to know whether you're the kind of person who can hold information without letting it change how you move." I told her I thought I was. She told me about Daniel Ball, 30 years old, Alpha King of the Iron Blood Pack for 8 years, since his father died in a border conflict that the official record called a failed negotiation and that everyone else called an ambush. He had taken the throne at 22 with a pack in debt, a military stretched thin across 3 contested territories, and a council of elders who had expected to manage him. Within 3 years he had restructured the pack's trade agreements, consolidated the border holdings, and doubled the agricultural output of every settlement under Iron Blood jurisdiction. The Elder Council had stopped expecting to manage him somewhere around year 2. By year 4 they had moved on to fearing him, which was more honest. He was, by every tactical and administrative measure, the most effective alpha the Iron Blood Pack had produced in 2 generations. And for the last 13 months he had been disappearing. That was how Petra said it, not that he had changed or deteriorated or lost control. Disappearing. As though the man who had built all of that was being slowly consumed from the inside, the wolf taking up more space than the human could hold, until what remained at the surface was something that operated on instinct alone. His eyes had stopped shifting back to human color. Amber gold, all hours, the full wolf stare in a human face. He hadn't appeared in council chambers in 4 months. He hadn't attended a formal function in 6. The keep ran on the decisions of his beta, Kale. Steady, pragmatic, holding things together with the focused desperation of a man plugging holes in a dam with his bare hands. The Elder Council had tried 3 times to address the succession problem directly. They called them compatibility assessments. What they were, Petra said, her voice dropping further, were women sent into proximity with a wolf so dominant that no female had been able to withstand the pressure of his presence. The first lasted 6 hours. Her wolf collapsed inward, full submission response, total catastrophic. Her mind followed. She was in the medical ward now, had been for 11 months, staring at a wall and flinching at sounds. The second made it nearly 2 days before she was found in the corridor outside the North Tower, unable to form words, her wolf fractured between the drive to submit and the drive to survive, 2 imperatives pulling in opposite directions until something simply snapped. She was in the ward too. They didn't expect either of them to improve. The third had volunteered. She was 24, from a high-ranking family, and she had believed that willingness would be protection enough. Her heart stopped on the 3rd day. The healer's report said submission-induced autonomic failure. Her body had obeyed the dominance signal so completely it had simply forgotten the instructions that kept her alive. The Elder Council had not sent a 4th candidate. Petra was quiet for a moment after she finished. Around us the meal hall murmured and clattered, ordinary sounds, the specific noise of people who have learned to keep the surface of things unremarkable. "The whole keep knows," she said finally. "Nobody talks about it above a whisper because nobody knows what talking about it accomplishes. He's too powerful to remove and too unstable to rule. And whatever he is now, behind that door in the North Tower." She picked up her bowl, the conversation closing with the same efficiency it had opened. "He hasn't been Daniel Ball in a very long time." I thought about that for the rest of the evening. I thought about it while I mopped the eastern corridor in straight lines. I thought about a man powerful enough to destroy 3 women without intending to, trapped inside a body that had become its own enemy. I thought, that is the loneliest thing I have ever heard. I should have stopped there. I didn't. Lady Sara of the Western Pact arrived on a Wednesday, which Petra told me afterward was deliberate. Wednesdays were staff inspection days, which meant every assigned worker in Stonecrest Keep would be visible, positioned, and required to be present in the corridors and halls they maintained. A diplomatic visit on a Wednesday was not a coincidence. It was a demonstration. Look how orderly we are. Look how completely we control everything inside these walls, down to the people who scrub the floors. I learned she was coming 20 minutes before she arrived, When Marta moved through the eastern corridor with the specific velocity of a person managing something she had not been given enough notice for and was furious about it in a way she would never let anyone see. Assigned workers to positions. Eyes down when the delegation passes. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not move unless instructed. Do not exist in any way that draws attention to yourselves. That last one was something I was usually good at. I was on my knees at the far end of the great hall when the doors opened, working the stone near the base of the eastern colonnade, scrub brush in hand, trying to be architecturally indistinct. The delegation entered the way delegations always enter, arranged, deliberate, the product of people who have spent considerable time deciding how they want to look while walking through a door. Lady Sarah was at the center of it. She was perhaps 40, striking in the way that very deliberate people sometimes are, dressed in deep blue and pale silver, the colors of the Western Pact, worn with the confidence of someone who has never in her life questioned whether she belonged in a room. She moved through the great hall with the calm, proprietary interest of a woman inspecting something she intended to eventually own. Around me, every assigned worker dropped their gaze. It happened in a wave, heads lowering in sequence as the delegation moved deeper into the hall. A human tide of performed invisibility. I was a half-second late. I don't have a good explanation for it. I was looking at her, trying to understand what kind of person arrives at a keep where the alpha is lost inside his own wolf and sees it primarily as a political opportunity, and the looking went a beat too long, and her gaze found mine before I got mine to the floor. The hall didn't go quiet. It was already nearly silent. But something shifted in the quality of the air. She stopped walking. Her gaze moved over me with the surgical patience of a woman who has made a career of finding the precise location of pressure points. She took in the slave disc at my throat, the rough spun cloth, the scrub brush in my cracked hands. She assembled these details into a conclusion and then she spoke, clearly, carrying to every corner of the hall. This one, she said, to no one specific and everyone present. How long has the keep been accepting assignments that don't know their own station? A few members of her delegation offered the kind of polished, minimal laughter that means I find this useful, not funny. I stayed on my knees. I kept my face composed. I had learned very young that the most dangerous thing you can do when someone is trying to make an example of you is give them a reaction worth using. Marta appeared from somewhere to my left with the speed of a person who had been tracking the situation from the moment it began. Apologies, Lady Sarah. It won't be repeated. See that it isn't. Sarah's gaze moved off me with the decisive indifference of a woman closing a ledger entry. The Iron Blood Pack standards are a reflection of its leadership. One would hope they remain worth reflecting. She moved on. The delegation followed. The hall exhaled. I went back to scrubbing. My hands were steady. That felt important. Petra found me that evening with an expression that meant bad news delivered quickly is still bad news. Marta had processed a reassignment. Effective the following morning, I was being moved off Eastern Corridor floor detail. I asked where I was being moved to. Petra told me. I sat with that for a moment. The North Tower. The sealed corridor. The reinforced door with the 4-inch gap that nobody was supposed to stand near. The place where 3 women had gone and come back as something less than themselves, or not come back at all. I thought about what Marta had said on my first day. You see that tower, you turn around, you walk away. I thought about Lady Sarah's face, that calm, calculated assessment, and the way she had looked at me not with contempt exactly, but with the specific expression of someone filing something away for later use. Someone had decided that a slave who didn't look down belonged near the most dangerous thing in Stonecrest Keep. I picked up my scrub brush and finished the floor. There was nothing else to do that night except be ready for what came next. The 2 guards at the base of the North Tower staircase looked at me the way people look at someone walking into the sea in their clothes, not stopping me. My reassignment papers were in order, Marta's seal on the bottom, everything correct, but watching with the particular helpless expression of men who have seen enough to know what this place does to people and have made their peace with the fact that it is not their job to prevent it. I took the stairs. The tower was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season, the kind of cold that lives in stone that hasn't been warmed by ordinary human activity in a long time. My footsteps were the only sound until I reached the landing, and then they weren't, because from somewhere above me I could hear something that my ears processed as silence for one full second before my body understood it differently. Breathing. Heavy, slow, resonant through stone walls, the kind that doesn't belong to anything small or uncertain. The antechamber door was unlocked. I pushed it open. I had been told the room was damaged. Damaged was the wrong word. Damaged implies an event, something that happened once and left a mark. What I was looking at was the evidence of duration. The iron side table was overturned, one leg sheared off at the base. The chairs were kindling, stacked against the far wall by accident or design. It was impossible to tell. A round iron shield hung on the wall or had hung there. It was still on its mounting bracket but caved inward from the front, dented in a curve that matched a fist or a forehead, or the specific geometry of something throwing its weight against the only surface available. Claw marks raked the stone floor in long, parallel furrows, deep enough that I could fit my fingers into them. The pattern was unmistakable once I understood what I was reading. Back and forth, back and forth. The path of something pacing a fixed distance, measuring the same ground over and over, learning by repetition the precise dimensions of its own containment. I stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed through the instinct that told me to leave. It was a loud instinct. I had always found loud instincts worth examining before obeying, because sometimes they were correct and sometimes they were just fear wearing the costume of wisdom, and the two looked identical from the inside. At the far end of the antechamber was the reinforced door. Iron-banded oak, thick enough to muffle sound, hinged to open inward. It was standing open by exactly 4 inches. The gap was dark, and from it came the breathing I'd heard on the stairs. Closer now, slower, with a depth and resonance that I felt in my sternum before my ears fully characterized it. The air near the door had a pressure to it, the particular atmospheric weight of the moment before a storm commits to itself. Every functional instinct I had said, "Do not walk toward that door." I picked up my cleaning cloth and walked toward that door. I stopped at the gap. I did not look through it. Looking felt like a provocation I hadn't earned the right to make yet. I looked at the floor instead, at the claw marks that were densest here, deepest here, where something had stood longest, closest to the boundary between its space and the outer room. I said, to the gap, to the dark behind it, to whatever was breathing on the other side. I'm not here to hurt anything. I'm here to clean the floor. I'll stay on my side. Silence. Not empty silence, full silence, the kind that means something is listening. I counted 7 of my own heartbeats in it. Then, from behind the door, low and resonant and traveling through the wood and stone and 4 inches of open air to find me where I stood. A sound. Not a word. Not a growl exactly. The sound a very large predator makes when something has entered its territory and it has assessed the thing and decided, provisionally, that the thing does not require action. An acknowledgement, a permission of sorts. I chose to treat it as one. I cleaned the antechamber. Took 2 hours. I repaired what could be righted, catalogued what needed replacement, swept the stone dust from the claw furrows, and worked my way across the floor in the straight lines that Petra said indicated psychological stability. I kept my movements unhurried and my sounds ordinary, the small, unremarkable noise of someone doing a job. The breathing on the other side of the door did not change, did not accelerate, did not approach. When I finished, I gathered my supplies, walked back to the landing, and went down the stairs. I came back the next morning. I want to be precise about what happened over those 15 days, because imprecision would make it sound like something it wasn't. It wasn't a courtship. It wasn't a negotiation. It was closer to what happens when 2 people are caught in the same storm long enough that they stop pretending the other one isn't there. It started with food. On day 4 I brought my own meal ration to the North Tower. Bread, dried meat, an apple that had seen better days but was still structurally sound, and left it on a cloth near the gap in the door before I began cleaning. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I set it down the way you set something down when you're not entirely sure you're making the right decision but you've decided to make it anyway. When I arrived the next morning, the cloth was folded and the food was gone. I brought food again the next day. And the next. By day 7 it had become a fact of the morning, as unremarkable in its repetition as the cleaning itself, and I thought that was probably the point. That things become safe when they become ordinary, and I was trying to make myself ordinary enough to be trusted. On day 8 I arrived to find something outside my dormitory cell that hadn't been there when I'd gone to sleep. A cloak, heavy, wolf pelt lined, folded with a precision that didn't match the hands I was beginning to understand had made it. I had not mentioned the cold. I had mentioned it adjacently. I talked while I cleaned on day 6, the way I had started doing because the silence was full and it seemed rude not to fill it, and I'd said something about the East dormitory heating being optimistic at best, and clearly some part of what was behind that door had been listening more carefully than I'd realized. I put the cloak on. It was warm in the way that things are warm when they've been made with attention rather than obligation. I didn't say thank you out loud because I didn't know how to do that without it sounding like more than I was ready to mean. Instead, I brought venison the next morning, which was the best thing in my current meal rotation, and I thought that was probably a language we both spoke. On day 9, near the gap, I found a small carved disc. Rough wood, edges not quite smoothed, the kind of object that gets made by hands working through something difficult and landing on gentleness almost by accident. I held it for a long time before I understood what it was. Not a message exactly, more like evidence. Someone behind that door had used their hands for something that wasn't destruction, and wanted me to know it. I kept it in my pocket. I still have it. The gap widened. 4 inches became 6 sometime around day 10, and I noticed but didn't remark on it, the same way I hadn't remarked on the cloak or the disc. Some things lose their meaning if you name them too directly. By day 14 it was nearly a foot, and I had started positioning myself slightly closer to it when I talked, which I was doing more of now. Not about anything consequential, about the keep's politics as filtered through Petra, about the way the Great Hall flagstones had a different grain than the tower stone, about a bird that had been nesting in the eastern courtyard eaves and had very strong opinions about the staff who passed beneath it. The rumbles came irregularly, the way they always had. Low, resonant, corresponding to moments in my talking that carried weight. I had learned to read them as responses and had stopped thinking of it as unusual. On day 12, mid-sentence, I was explaining the bird, its grievances, its targets. I heard something that stopped every word I owned. 2 syllables. Rough, fractured, formed with the effort of a man using a language his mouth had almost lost the shape of. Not quite right. Close enough to be unmistakable. Beak. I stood with the scrub brush in my hand and looked at the gap in the door and did not cry. It was a near thing. It was the nearest thing I had experienced since Ashvin, and that is saying something significant. I breathed through it until the feeling moved back to a manageable distance, and then I said, as evenly as I could manage, "That's right. That's my name." From behind the door, the breathing continued. Steady. Slow. On day 18 the gap was wide enough that when I looked up from the floor at the right angle, I could see his eyes. Amber gold, all the way through, no human color remaining. Watching me with an expression I spent the following weeks trying to name and eventually stopped trying, because the word I kept arriving at was the only one that fit. Recognition. Like something that had been waiting a long time to see a specific thing had finally quietly seen it. I went back to cleaning. Neither of us said anything else. It was enough. The summit was not announced to the assigned workers. We were informed of it the way the keep informed us of most things. Through the sudden acceleration of everything, Marta moving through the dormitory corridor before dawn with a lamp and a list and the energy of someone who had not slept and did not intend to until the crisis resolved itself. All hands. Full rotation. Guest quarters on the 2nd and 3rd floors to be prepared by mid-morning. Great hall cleared, scrubbed, and dressed for formal use by noon. Kitchen support through the afternoon service. And then regular assignments on top of it, because the keep did not stop requiring maintenance simply because 3 allied packs were arriving simultaneously and every senior staff member had developed a permanent expression of controlled emergency. I was on my feet before the lamp left the corridor. The morning was the great hall, on my knees with the scrub brush, working the stone in sections, moving from the colonnade to the center and back again while the kitchen staff carried things around me and the yard workers brought in extra wood and someone above me dropped something heavy twice in the same spot and never explained it. By mid-morning my knees had gone from aching to a kind of sustained complaint that I had learned to file away and address later, when later existed. The guest quarters took the afternoon. Floors, surfaces, linens, the particular detailed work of making spaces look as though no one has ever lived imperfectly inside them. I worked 3 rooms in sequence, moving through them with the methodical focus of someone who has discovered that methodical focus is a reasonable substitute for energy when energy is no longer available. Kitchen support ran through the evening service. I carried, I cleaned, I did what I was pointed at, and I stopped tracking time somewhere around the 8th hour because tracking time had stopped being useful. There was only the next task and the one after that. By the time Marta released the kitchen rotation, it was well past dark. Most of the other assigned workers moved toward the dormitory with the unanimity of people whose bodies had made the decision before their minds caught up. I stood in the kitchen corridor and remembered the North Tower. My regular assignment. Still on the day's list. Marta had not said otherwise. I considered briefly the possibility of simply not going. Of deciding that 20 hours was enough for one body and that the antechamber could wait until morning. I thought about it for long enough to know I wasn't going to do it, and then I picked up the supply cloth and the food parcel I'd set aside that morning and walked to the North Tower stairs. The guards looked at me. Neither of them said anything. I think they had stopped having the energy for the particular expression they usually made. The stairs took longer than they should have. My legs had entered a phase of operation that I can only describe as theoretical. They were performing the motions of climbing without any meaningful input from the rest of me. I reached the landing. I pushed open the antechamber door. The room was as I'd left it the previous morning. I set down my supplies and looked at the inner door and stopped. It was fully open. Not 4 inches, not 6, not the nearly a foot of day 18. Open. All the way. The gap that had been widening for 19 days had finally, tonight, become a doorway. I stood at the threshold and looked into the chamber. Firelight. The hearth was burning low and warm, casting amber across the wolf pelt furs piled on the heavy frame in the center of the room. He was there, on his back, one arm at his side. The way I had begun to understand was simply how he existed in the space when the wolf was near the surface. His eyes were open. They found me immediately. I meant to set down his food and leave. I meant to do exactly that. I crossed the room. I set the parcel on the stone beside the furs. I sat down on the edge of the bed, on the very edge, just for a moment, just long enough for my legs to stop their theoretical operation and return to something more grounded. I closed my eyes for one breath. I did not choose what happened next. My body made that decision unilaterally, and by the time it had been made, I was no longer conscious to contest it. I woke to firelight and warmth and an arm around my waist that was firm and careful and absolutely immovable, and the sound of 30 wolves filling the outer doorway with their silence, staring at the thing that none of them had any framework for. I did not move. Neither did he. His heartbeat was steady beneath my cheek, slow and deep, and even in the first confused seconds of waking, some part of me recognized it. Not as dangerous, not as foreign, as the specific sound I had apparently been listening for without knowing it had a sound. From the doorway, someone's voice, low, stunned, stripped of its usual authority. Don't move. Vickie, whatever you do, don't move. I had no intention of moving. My body had already made its position on that very clear. By dawn the entire keep knew, which meant that by the time Kale, the beta, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, the man who had been holding Stonecrest together with pragmatism and sheer refusal to acknowledge defeat, escorted me down from the North Tower, I was walking through corridors of people who had already heard and were performing the particular stillness of individuals trying not to be caught staring. Marta's office was on the ground floor, small, ruthlessly organized, every surface carrying exactly the objects required for its function and nothing else. She was standing when I arrived, which told me the meeting had already exceeded its original category in her mind. Beside her, Elder Fenn, the keep's head healer, a white-haired man in his 60s who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that most situations rewarded patience over speed. He had a leather folio open in his hands and was looking at me over the top of it with an expression I needed a moment to identify. Not alarm. Not the administrative frustration I'd expected from Marta. Something closer to the face a person makes when a phenomenon they have been trying to understand for 13 months has just resolved itself through a mechanism they never considered and cannot immediately explain. Marta spoke first because Marta always spoke first. You entered the private chamber. Direct violation of your assignment parameters and every instruction given to you on your first day. The door was fully open, I said. A door being open is not an invitation. Felt like one. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she turned to Elder Fenn with the expression of a woman delegating a problem that has moved outside her jurisdiction. Explain what you told me this morning. Elder Fenn closed the folio. He had the manner of a man choosing his words with the care of someone who knows that imprecision in his field has consequences. The Alpha King's wolf has maintained full dominance for 13 months, he said. In that time we have attempted sedation compounds, 7 varieties of herbal regulation, 2 of the old spirit-binding rituals, and 3 direct compatibility assessments. The assessments were the most critical failures. He paused. Every female wolf introduced into proximity triggered one of 2 responses. Either her wolf collapsed in full submission, the dominance pressure simply overwhelmed her, or his wolf escalated in response to the proximity, which compounded the pressure further. The differential was unsurvivable. He stopped, looked at me again with that same expression. Her wolf did neither, he said to Marta, as though I wasn't present, and then caught himself and addressed me directly. Your wolf signature doesn't submit. It doesn't resist. It simply doesn't register the dominance differential as applicable. As though the signal that triggers submission response in every other female wolf in this pack doesn't reach you. You equalize. His dominance has nothing to press against, so it doesn't press. And without that pressure, he opened the folio again, not to read from it but to have something to do with his hands, I thought. He rested. Actually rested. His heart rate normalized within 20 minutes of contact. By the time we found you this morning, it had been stable for 6 hours. 6 hours, for the first time in 13 months. He said it the way a healer says something when the data is incontrovertible and the explanation is not yet available. I have no framework for this. The silence that followed had the quality of a room holding its breath. Then the door opened. He entered without knocking, which told me everything about his relationship with the concept of other people's spaces. High Counselor Reeve. Silver-haired, precisely dressed, carrying himself with the accumulated weight of a man who has been the most politically significant person in most rooms for several decades and has arranged his posture accordingly. He was perhaps 55, lean, with the kind of careful face that reveals nothing it hasn't decided to reveal. Behind him, Lady Sarah. She looked at me, not the way she had looked at me in the Great Hall 3 weeks ago, with that sharp, dismissive contempt designed for an audience. This was different. Quieter, more deliberate, the expression of a woman who has received new information about something she had already categorized and is now recategorizing it with complete, unhurried attention. It was worse than the contempt. The contempt had been impersonal. This was interest. The council has been informed, Reeve said to Marta, to Elder Fenn, to the room, as has Lady Sarah's delegation, given the political implications of last night's event. He paused with the timing of a man who has given enough speeches to know where the weight falls. We want a controlled repetition. Tonight, with council observers present. I looked at Cale. He met my eyes with the expression of a man who did not like this, had not liked it from the moment Reeve walked through the door, and did not currently have the political standing to stop it. I looked at Elder Fenn. He looked back with the specific hunger of a healer who needed more data and was not proud of how much he needed it. I looked at Marta. She looked at me with the flat, honest gaze of a woman who had told me on my first day to stay out of the North Tower, had watched me not do that, and had arrived at the point where she had nothing left to offer except the truth of the situation as it stood. I stood up. Something in me understood that the rest of this conversation was not a negotiation I could afford to conduct from a chair. I have conditions, I said. Reeves' expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees. Sarah's didn't shift at all, which was more unsettling. No observers inside the chamber. No restraints. No sedation compounds. I looked at Kale when I said the next part. Only the Beta and Elder Fen at the outer door. And before I go back in, someone tells me his name. His actual name. Not his title. Not the Alpha King. His name. Because I've been cleaning his floor for 19 days and talking to him through a door and I still don't know it, and I'm not walking back in there to be observed like a phenomenon without knowing the name of the person I'm walking into. The room was quiet. It was Kale who answered. Low, and with something in it that was not quite grief but lived in the same neighborhood. Daniel, he said. His name is Daniel. They tripled the guards at the base of the North Tower stairs, which I understood was for the council's comfort rather than any practical purpose. Whatever was going to happen in that chamber tonight was not going to be affected by the number of people standing at the bottom of the staircase. Reeve had wanted observers in the antechamber. I had said no and held the no with the particular stillness of someone who has identified the one thing they will not move on. He had eventually accepted modified terms. Kale and Elder Fen at the outer door, the council in the corridor below, Sarah wherever Sarah went when she wasn't in her room making it colder. Kale walked me to the landing. He stopped at the antechamber door and looked at me with the expression he'd been wearing since Marta's office. That contained, careful look of a man managing his own fear on behalf of someone else. If anything feels wrong, he said, anything at all, you come out. I told him I would. I meant it as much as I meant anything that evening, which was partially, because the truth was that I didn't know what wrong would feel like in that room anymore. Wrong had rearranged itself somewhere around day 4, when I'd started bringing food to a door and calling it ordinary. I pushed the antechamber door open and stopped. The room was different. Not cleaned. I was apparently the only person performing that particular function, but changed. The iron side table that had been on its back since my first morning was upright, the sheared leg reattached with a makeshift iron bracket, rough work, functional. The chairs that had been kindling against the wall had been res-tacked into something approaching their original purpose. The shield on the wall had been pulled from its bracket and bent back. Not to its original shape, the dent was still visible, but deliberately worked on, the metal pressed back by hand until it was closer to flat. Someone had spent time on it. Someone had used hands that were more accustomed to destruction and had made them do something different. I crossed the antechamber and pushed the inner door open. The fire was burning higher than I'd seen it. In its light, on the stone floor near the hearth, a cloth had been laid out. On it, bread, dried apple slices, a section of honeycomb still in the comb, amber and precise. I recognized the arrangement before I recognized the food. It was the same pattern I used when I left his meals, the same spacing, the same cloth folded at the same corner. The summit tray that staff left outside the North Tower corridor each night had reportedly never been touched in 13 months. Tonight someone had not only taken it but had reconstructed its contents into the only meal format they apparently knew. He was standing at the far side of the room, watching me take it in. I sat down on the floor beside the cloth. After a moment, he crossed the room and sat across from me. Not close, but within the shared space of the fire's warmth, and we ate. I didn't speak, which was unusual for me in this room, but the silence had a quality to it that talking would have damaged. It was the most honest silence I had sat in for years, possibly ever, the kind that only exists between people who have run out of performances to give each other. The honeycomb was extraordinary. I didn't ask where it had come from. Some questions are less important than the answer they represent. When the cloth was empty, I looked at him across the fire and asked the only thing that was left to ask. Can I stay? He stood. He walked to the furs. He lay down on his back. The same position, the same deliberate stillness, and looked at me. Not a command. Not a request. An answer, offered without words, by a man who was rebuilding his relationship with words one careful syllable at a time, and had decided that this particular answer was too important to risk getting wrong. I lay down beside him. My cheek found his chest. His arm came around my waist with the same firm, careful weight I remembered from the morning, the grip that was protective in a way that didn't ask permission because it wasn't about control. It was about the specific instinct of something that has identified the one thing in its world that makes it calm and will not casually release it. His heartbeat was steady, slow, human in its rhythm in a way I was beginning to understand was not guaranteed, was not a given, was something that only happened here, like this, with the specific arrangement of this firelight and this warmth and my weight against his ribs. From beyond the outer door, Elder Fenn's voice, stripped down to its essential frequency by something between professional awe and personal disbelief. Alpha signature receding. He's pulling back toward baseline. Kale, he's shifting back toward baseline. I closed my eyes. Then, beneath my ear, something that rearranged everything that came before it and everything that would come after. A sound formed with the effortful precision of a man who has been a long time without language and is rebuilding it from the foundation up. One word chosen because it was the only one that contained everything he needed to say. Stay. Not the wolf reaching for sound. Not instinct wearing the shape of speech. The man. Deliberate. Present. Choosing. I pressed closer. I'm staying, I said. I'm right here. His arm tightened. His breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of genuine sleep, and for the first time in 13 months, Daniel Ball rested. Not because the healers had found the right compound or the council had found the right candidate, but because a red-haired slave from a village called Ashvin had sat across from him in firelight and eaten honeycomb in silence and asked if she could stay. And he had remembered how to say yes. He slept the way I imagined he must have slept before all of this, completely, without the fractured restlessness that Elder Fenn's records described, without the physical tension of a body holding itself against something. His breathing was deep and even and slow, and beneath my cheek his heartbeat maintained its steady rhythm, and I lay still and listened to it and tried to understand what my life had become. 19 days ago I had been number 14, scrubbing stone floors in straight lines, practicing invisibility as a survival strategy. I had a wooden disc in my pocket that a scarred king had carved with hands learning to be gentle, and a wolf pelt cloak in my cell that had been left there by something that noticed I was cold before I'd mentioned it, and a pressed wildflower between the pages of the only book I'd brought from Ashvin, and I still wasn't entirely certain what any of it meant except that it meant something, and that the something was fragile in the specific way that honest things are fragile, not weak, but unprotected. Built without walls because walls hadn't seemed necessary when it was just a cracked door and a cloth of food and two people finding a language that didn't require either of them to perform anything. The fire had burned lower. The chamber was warm, amber-lit, quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something in them has finally stopped fighting. I was not going to sleep. I understood that. My mind had moved past the exhaustion of the previous 22 hours into a different kind of wakefulness. The alert, clarifying state that comes when the body is still and the mind understands it cannot afford to be. I watched the firelight move across the furs and across the scarred landscape of his chest, and I thought about Elder Fenn's voice saying he's pulling back toward baseline with that quality of a man witnessing something his 13 months of failure had not prepared him to receive gracefully. I thought about Daniel saying stay, one word, one syllable, the first human word in 13 months. And what it had cost him to find it and offer it and mean it all at once. I was thinking about this when I heard the voices. They came through the gap at the outer door, traveling the distance from the corridor beyond the antechamber with the particular clarity of a stone keep at night, when the ambient sound drops away and what remains carries further than it should. Two voices. I identified them before I identified the words. Reeves' measured precision and Sarah's quieter register. The two of them in the corridor below the antechamber door, speaking at the volume of people who believe they are not being heard. Reeves spoke first. Forget the alliance. Pause. Forget the Luna candidacy entirely. That avenue is closed and has been closed. We simply hadn't acknowledged it. Another pause, longer, the silence of a man allowing a conclusion to land before he states it. She's more useful than any political match. She's not a Luna, Sarah. She's a collar. And a collar is exactly what this pack needs right now. I did not move. I could not have moved if I had wanted to. Daniel's arm was around me and I would not have broken this, would not have cracked the surface of this particular moment for anything available to me. But the warmth of the fire was no longer reaching whatever had just gone cold in the center of my chest. I lay still and breathed and let the words settle into me with the complete, clarifying precision of something you hear once and never unhear. Not a Luna, collar. Not a person who had found her way into proximity with a broken king through 19 days of food and silence and a language built from small things. A mechanism. A tool with a specific function that two political architects had just identified and were now calmly discussing how to deploy. I became aware of a change against my ribs before I fully processed what it meant. A subtle shift in the arm around my waist, not releasing, tightening by the smallest increment the difference between holding and holding on. A change in the breathing beneath my cheek, a fractional deepening. The almost imperceptible alteration of a man whose sleep has been disturbed by something that has reached past the rest into whatever remained alert beneath it. He had heard. The wolf, even in its retreat. The man, even just returned to himself. Both of them had heard every word, and the arm around me told me everything about what they thought of it. We lay still together in the firelight, a red-haired slave from a conquered village and a scarred king learning to be a man again, and we did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more precisely. The thing we had built, carefully, in secret, through a cracked door and shared meals and a carved wooden disc and one wildflower I had never told anyone about, had just been named by someone else. Had just been assigned a function by people who saw a tool where we had found something true. I thought about Ashvin, about being counted in a ledger and translated into economic value. About number 14, invisible, practicing disappearance as a form of survival. I thought about 19 days and a gap in a door that had started at 4 inches and ended fully open. His arm tightened again, slightly, the adjustment of something that has identified a threat and responded to it in the only language currently available. Not with aggression, not with the wolf-dominant violence that had driven 3 women out of their own minds, but with the deliberate, considered pressure of a man making a declaration without words. I pressed closer. Let him feel that I wasn't moving. We had not come this far, through all the silence and the small careful things and one word spoken at the cost of 13 months of lost language, to become someone else's instrument. Whatever Reeve and Sarah were planning in that corridor, whatever framework they were building around us, they were building it without our agreement, and agreements I had learned were the only things worth having. The fire burned. His heartbeat steadied. Outside the door, the voices moved away down the corridor, and the quiet that replaced them was different from the quiet before. Heavier, purposeful. The silence of 2 people who have just understood simultaneously that the world has changed and that what they do next will matter. I closed my eyes. Not to sleep, to think, to begin. We had work to do. Please subscribe to this channel if you enjoy the story.